early August of the year 2009, something started brewing quietly over the warm waters of the western Pacific. Didn't seem like much at first, just a tropical depression forming far out to sea, roughly 1,000 kilometers east of Luzon in the Philippines. But that small storm was the beginning of what would become Typhoon Morakot, a disaster that would go down as the wettest and deadliest typhoon in Taiwan's recorded history. At first, it struggled to stay organized. Meteorologists even downgraded it briefly, thinking it might not develop further. But nature had other plans. Later that same day, the system pulled itself together again. It strengthened slowly but steadily, and by August 3rd, the Japan Meteorological Agency had given it a name, Morakot. In the Philippines, they called it Typhoon Kiko. As the storm moved west, it picked up strength. By August 5th, Morakot had reached typhoon status. The winds had grown stronger, with the Joint Typhoon Warning Center recording sustained 1-minute winds of about 150 kilometers per hour. The storm wasn't massive in terms of wind, but what it lacked in brute force, it made up for in size and moisture. This typhoon wasn't just strong, it was slow. That slow movement would be key to the destruction it would later cause. Around this time, countries in its path began issuing warnings. In Japan, gale alerts were sent out across regions like Moji, Yokohama, and Naha. On Okinawa, U.S. military bases raised their tropical cyclone readiness level, preparing for strong winds. In the Philippines, authorities warned residents in northern Luzon and nearby islands that the storm could bring heavy rain, not necessarily from direct impact, but by enhancing the southwest monsoon. As expected, that monsoon would later lead to deadly flooding in parts of the country, killing over 24 people. But Taiwan was about to face the worst of it. On August 5th, the Central Weather Bureau there issued a sea typhoon alert. Just 2 days later, Morakot reached its peak strength with a pressure of 945 millibars and wind speeds that matched a Category 1 hurricane. Then it started creeping toward the island, very slowly. That's when the real trouble began. On the morning of August 7th, 2009, Typhoon Morakot made landfall in Taiwan. Although it had weakened from its peak intensity, the storm brought with it an overwhelming force of wind and rain. The winds were strong enough to uproot trees and damage rooftops, but it was the rain that would leave the most lasting impact. As the typhoon stalled over the island, it unleashed an unprecedented amount of rainfall. Some areas recorded over 100 inches within a span of just 3 days. The steep mountains of southern and central Taiwan, already vulnerable to landslides, quickly became saturated. Hillsides gave way, sending waves of mud and debris crashing into everything in their path. Entire villages were cut off, as roads were buried and bridges were swept away by rising rivers. Rivers overflowed their banks, submerging streets and homes under muddy water. In the city of Tainan and the surrounding regions, families were forced to evacuate quickly as floodwaters rose faster than anyone expected. The nonstop rain overwhelmed drainage systems, triggered flash floods, and isolated dozens of towns. Military personnel were deployed to assist, but many areas were unreachable. Helicopters flew through heavy rain to drop supplies as thousands of people were left without shelter, food, or clean water. While Typhoon Morakot continued to drift slowly away from Taiwan, the destruction it caused was only beginning to reveal itself. One of the most devastating consequences of Typhoon Morakot unfolded in a remote area of southern Taiwan. On the morning of August 8th, just 1 day after the typhoon made landfall, the village of Xiaolin in Kaohsiung County faced a disaster unlike anything in recent memory. After more than 48 hours of intense rainfall, the mountains above the village could no longer hold. A massive landslide was triggered, described by witnesses as a roaring wall of earth and rock that descended without warning. Within moments, nearly the entire village was buried. Hundreds of homes were completely destroyed, and many residents had no time to escape. Only a small number of villagers managed to survive by fleeing to higher ground or clinging to the edges of the landslide zone. Rescue crews were delayed due to washed-out roads and unstable terrain, and helicopters were the only way to reach the area. When rescuers finally arrived, they were met with a scene of total destruction. Rooftops barely visible above the mud, and entire families missing. Search efforts continued for days, but the scale of the landslide made recovery nearly impossible. The soil was unstable, and heavy machinery could not reach the site without risking further collapse. By the end of the operation, it was estimated that over 400 people had lost their lives in Xiaolin alone. The tragedy became a symbol of the typhoon's deadly impact. For many across Taiwan, it marked a painful turning point, revealing how a single storm could change the course of countless lives in an instant. While the tragedy in Jiaolin village captured global attention, Typhoon Morakot's devastation extended far beyond a single location. Across Taiwan, countless communities faced widespread destruction. Roads were torn apart by rushing floodwaters, over 1,000 bridges were damaged or washed away, and vital transportation routes were rendered impassable. In the mountainous regions, dozens of smaller villages became isolated, cut off from help for several days. Agricultural regions in southern Taiwan suffered tremendous losses. Farmland was submerged for days, wiping out rice, banana, and vegetable crops that families depended on for both income and survival. Livestock drowned in flooded pens, and storage facilities filled with mud and debris. Farmers described the destruction as a complete reset of their livelihoods, with years of work undone in mere hours. Hospitals and emergency shelters quickly reached capacity. Over 20,000 people were forced to evacuate and spent weeks in temporary shelters, set up in schools, stadiums, and military camps. These facilities were crowded and under-resourced, making it difficult for authorities to provide basic supplies such as food, water, and medicine. The scale of the disaster drew international attention. Countries including the United States, Japan, and South Korea offered financial assistance and sent rescue teams to support Taiwan's overwhelmed emergency services. Charitable organizations and NGOs also stepped in, distributing supplies and helping displaced families find temporary housing. In response to the growing crisis, Taiwan's government faced mounting pressure to act quickly. Military helicopters were dispatched to deliver aid and airlift the injured. Engineers worked around the clock to rebuild access roads and restore power and communication lines. Despite these efforts, many citizens criticized the government's initial response as too slow, especially in the first critical days after the storm. The aftermath of Typhoon Morakot became not only a humanitarian crisis, but also a national reckoning, forcing Taiwan to confront the weaknesses in its disaster response system and infrastructure planning. In the weeks and months after Typhoon Morakot left Taiwan, the country began the long and painful road to recovery. Entire communities had to be relocated, especially in mountainous regions where the land was no longer stable. More than 40 villages were declared unsafe to live in, and thousands of survivors were moved to newly constructed housing sites built by the government and aid groups. While these new homes offered safety, many families struggled with the emotional toll of being separated from ancestral land and lifelong neighbors. The emotional scars of the disaster ran deep. Families who had lost loved ones or whose homes were swept away had to cope with trauma and grief while rebuilding their lives from the ground up. Schools reopened, but some classrooms had empty seats that would never be filled again. Survivors organized memorial events to honor the dead, especially those lost in Jiaolin village. These gatherings became a space for both mourning and community healing. Government officials soon launched a full investigation into how the disaster had unfolded. Studies revealed that poor land use policies, unregulated construction in vulnerable areas, and outdated flood management systems had made the damage far worse than it needed to be. In response, Taiwan introduced major changes in its disaster prevention planning. New laws were passed to ban construction in high-risk areas, and investment in early warning systems was significantly increased. Internationally, Typhoon Morakot also served as a warning. It became a case study in how slow-moving tropical storms can be just as dangerous as fast, powerful typhoons. Meteorologists and emergency planners around the world began rethinking how to measure storm threats, focusing more on rainfall and flood risk rather than just wind speed. By the one-year anniversary of the storm, Taiwan had made major progress in rebuilding, but the impact of Typhoon Morakot continued to shape the nation's approach to disaster resilience. It was no longer just about reacting to storms, it was about preparing for them with better science, better infrastructure, and stronger community support. Typhoon Morakot did not just leave behind destruction or it changed how a country understood nature's power and how human decisions could either lessen or worsen that impact. The storm remains one of the most important reminders in Taiwan's modern history that resilience is not only about rebuilding, but about learning, adapting, and never forgetting what was lost.